Chapter 23. Monday, early evening. Oh, Doreen said, you mean other than the 6 remains on Steve's property? Mac nodded. Exactly. So, another person? She shook her head, sad for the loss of life yet again. Wow. That's sad. It is, he said. And that's why I was out for hours, trying to see what we could find. We had to bring in an anthropologist to take a look. So they were old? Well, they weren't that old, but no flesh was left on them. Right. They were in a condition where the decomposition happened relatively quickly. It was actually on one of the trails out toward Paul's tomb, he said. The body was only partially buried, and more or less just lying there for the exposure to the elements to speed up decay. Animal damage? Some, he said. Lots of bug activity because, of course, Mother Nature always has an answer for cleaning up her own garbage. Too bad humans don't, Doreen said with spirit. Because, well, we've got a landfill issue everywhere around the world. Particularly the oceans. Isn't that the truth? Any idea who the body is? He shook his head. Sex, she asked. Female. Age? Mature, but we don't know more than that. She frowned at that. You should be able to tell more than just that. He glared at her and she shrugged. Height? Don't have that yet either. You should have some idea. He rolled his eyes at her. If you want the general gist, we're thinking Caucasian with dyed hair because some of the strands were sitting there, as if they were heavily dyed and hadn't decomposed. Probably in her early 30s to mid-30s, and the one thing that apparently could be told was when she had had a child. Right, Doreen said with a nod. The pelvis joint. And then she stopped, her eyes going wide as she said, Manny? Max stopped what he was doing, turned to look at her, and frowned. That would be good. Yet bad. He shook his head. It would be an answer, but you know we probably have half a dozen missing women just from Kelowna, fitting that same description. She stared at him in surprise. If that's the case, why haven't I heard of them? She demanded. He just went back to stirring the pasta on the stovetop. It would be great if it was him. And then she stopped and said, I'm sorry. That's incredibly selfish of me. He looked at her curiously. She shrugged. I was just thinking about the fact that it would be nice if he had left with that fairy tale ending he'd put into his letter to Peter, and came back triumphant and successful, having kicked the drugs out of his system, and he was now happily married and doing good works for the world. That's a very Pollyanna-like attitude, Max said. Of course we want that for everybody. But chances are it's not likely to have happened. Doreen nodded. I get that. How long until we know? Max shrugged. Can't really pinpoint that. A couple days to a couple weeks. If it is Manny, there should be some records. And her mother is of course still alive in the old folks' home, if you're looking for DNA. I know. I was just thinking of that. But we don't know that it is Manny yet. No, but if you're looking for somebody to compare it to. Mac pulled out his phone and sent a text but didn't tell her what it was about. When he put the phone back in his pocket, he said, Another 5 minutes and we can eat. Good, she said as she poured coffee. It's just enough time to have a cup of coffee. He shook his head. I should have put it on afterward. There's no right or wrong time to put on coffee. If there's one thing I really enjoy now, it's coffee when I want it. Couldn't you have coffee before whenever you wanted it? She nodded. To a certain extent, yes. But not necessarily. That makes no sense. He didn't agree with it in the afternoon or evening. He said it causes wrinkles. At that, Max stopped stirring to stare at the garden and to let out a very long, slow breath. I really do want to meet this guy just one time. His tone was conversational, but there was tension in it. I don't, she said. That's a part of my life that's over. I'd be happy to never see him again. Speaking of which, I was talking to my brother last night. Doreen froze this time. She walked over to stand closer so she could see his face. And he turned to look at her. He wants to talk to you. She winced. You know I really don't want to go over anything, right? I think there's too much to explain on the phone. He thinks you have a really good case. He wants to take you on, but there's stuff he needs to know. A really good case for what? Take me on for how much? He said he's willing to do it for his normal fee, but it would come out of the money you got from your husband. And if I don't get any money from my husband? Max smirked. Then he doesn't get paid. She stared at him suspiciously. That doesn't sound right. I thought lawyers always got paid. The occasional few will take their money out of the spoils, he said, but they usually only do that if they think they have a really good chance of getting you something. She thought about it, walking to the kitchen doorway, where she leaned against the open door and stared at the waning sunshine. It did make sense he would take his money out of the money she was legally due, but she also knew her ex was pretty wily. She didn't know if Mac's brother was crafty enough to go up against him. I'm afraid he'll end up doing all this work for nothing, she announced. It's possible, Mac said as he walked over to the cupboard. He pulled out 2 plates. But that's his decision. It also depends on how much money he's expecting to get paid for his work, because if there isn't enough left over for me to make this all worthwhile, why would I bother? To make your ex pay regardless, Mac said with a laugh. That would be the #1 reason most women would do it. She stared at him soberly for a long moment. Not me, she said quietly. I want to move on. You might want to move on, he said, but that doesn't mean that legally he doesn't owe you. But how much am I likely to get out of this? You know. Your brother probably wants $30, $50, $60, $70, or maybe $100,000, she said. I really have no clue. Mac named a figure in the middle of that, and she nodded. So, how much will I get that'll make it worthwhile to pay him to do this? I don't want revenge to be the motivator in my life. I do it for justice, maybe. A part of me has been hurt and devastated, and wants to know I really was entitled to something after all those years. But I can't do it just because it's something a lot of women would do. He smiled at her, leaned against the stove, and crossed his arms over his chest. And that's just one of the reasons you are so different from a lot of women. She shrugged. I used to be like a lot of women. Now I'm determined to be me, uniquely, whatever it is that makes me, me. So I need the right reasoning for doing this. There's the fact you would probably never have to work again. Her eyes widened. How does he figure that? Because you were there for so much of your husband's business building years, so you're entitled to half. Doreen winced. I can tell you right now, if your brother goes after that, my life's in danger. Max straightened and lost the comfortable slopes in his stance. Seriously? She nodded. Yes. No way he'll let me have half. He'd kill me first.